I created a movie with ChatGPT and Midjourney. Here are the results.
Trapped in a dystopian world, can they survive the unimaginable? Chapter 1. Setting the scene. The world as we once knew it is no more. The skies were a cloudy shade of orange, as the once clamoring roads of New York were currently abandoned. Individuals had locked themselves inside, as the dread of the obscure was obvious in the air. It was 2027, and the effect of dangerous atmospheric devastation had been disastrous, with outrageous weather conditions causing an unmatched obliteration and death toll. Floods had ravaged cities and towns, resulting in the water being contaminated and spreading deadly diseases. Heat waves had reached temperatures never seen before, leaving people struggling to survive and dying in their thousands from dehydration and heat stroke. Crushing twisters had destroyed homes and networks, leaving only rubble afterward. To make matters worse, an infection emerged, beginning in Antarctic water and killing anyone who contracted it, with no cure in sight. George sat in his front room, astonished by the situation unfolding before his eyes. He realized he needed to move quickly to get to his folks in Virginia. As he tried to think of a plan, his grandparents offered to accompany him on the journey. He acknowledged this, realizing he was unable to do it single-handedly. They started packing essential supplies, including food, water, weapons, and clinical supplies. The feeling of dread toward the obscure was discernible in the air. The once bustling roads of New York were presently empty, as individuals locked themselves indoors, too frightened to even consider wandering outside. The journey would be dangerous, but he is entirely committed to reaching his family and protecting them. He realized he must be smart and clever, depending on his experience in the military, to explore the confusion. The three set out on their journey with a feeling of direction and assurance driving them forward. Chapter 2. The dangerous journey begins. George and his grandparents set off on their journey to Virginia with the heaviness of the world on their shoulders. The roads were once clamoring with life. However, presently, they are abandoned, and the main sounds are the far-off alarms of crisis vehicles. The apprehension about the obscure was discernible in the air, and it was apparent in the essences of everybody they encountered. As they moved toward the bridge to Staten Island, George's telephone rang, and he answered it to find Jada on the other end in a state of distress. She informed him that her dad had been bitten by someone and was now attempting to hurt her. The journey had just become more dangerous, and George realized he needed to move quickly. At the point when they showed up at Jada's home, the entryway was open, and blood was scattered on the floor. The hairs on the back of George's neck stood up, and he warily went into the house with his grandparents, weapons close by. The scene that greeted them was one of horror, with broken furniture dispersed about and a path of blood prompting the basement. The dad rose out of the downstairs basement, running at George with a growl, his eyes currently dark and his skin pale. George responded rapidly, shooting Jada's father without a second thought. Jada and her mom rose out of their room, crying and appreciative of being rescued. They immediately assembled what they could and set off on their journey. The journey was treacherous, with upset vehicles and trash littering the streets, making it challenging to explore. Along the way, they encountered various survivors, some pleading for help, and others who had transformed into mindless animals, pursuing anything in their path. George needed to make split-second decisions, attempting to figure out whom they could trust and who represented a danger. He was a quick thinker, and his tactical military foundation trained him to constantly be careful. The road ahead was uncertain, and the dangers they faced were numerous. Be that as it may, he was determined to keep those he loved safe and would stop at nothing to ensure their survival. The journey had just barely started, and the road ahead was long and dangerous, yet George and his group were prepared for what may lay ahead. Chapter 3. Encountering the Undead. The sun was setting and the murkiness of the night was quickly drawing nearer. However, George and his family couldn't stand to stop. They had been driving for quite a long time, exploring the destruction of the world they once knew, and were beginning to run short on fuel. The only thought at the forefront was getting to Virginia, where their friends and family were hanging on to them. It was then that they began experiencing more zombie-like creatures. George was in the driver's seat, his eyes dashing between the street ahead and the rearview mirror, when he saw them. A gathering, or if nothing else, what used to be people, were in a large group down the road, their eyes fixed on the vehicle. They were covered in filth, their clothes torn and tattered, and their skin was pale and lifeless. George's heart raced as he slammed on the brakes, bringing the vehicle to a dramatic halt. He had never seen anything like this, and he was filled with a mix of fear and confusion. He went to his grandparents, who were in the back seat, and murmured, "We need to leave now." The group immediately leaped out of the vehicle, got their weapons and supplies, and headed toward a nearby corner store. George was on guard, his eyes examining the region for any signs of the creatures or people. He realized there was a weapons store across the road and made a split-second decision. He realizes that they needed to acquire more weapons, assuming there would be more dangers to Virginia, and he won't allow anything to stop him. He ran towards the firearms store, weapons close by, with his grandparents not far behind. The entryway was locked, but it was no issue for George. He immediately kicked it in, and they were met with an immense range of weapons and ammo. They filled their packs with however much they could carry and made a beeline for the vehicle. As they advanced back to the vehicle, they were encircled by the creatures. George and his grandparents retaliated with all that they had, shooting and hacking their way through the creatures. They finally returned to the vehicle, their hearts racing and their adrenaline pumping, and drove away. Until the end of the journey, they experienced increasingly more of the undead, each experience turning out to be more nerve-wracking than the last. Be that as it may, George and his family were determined to make it to Virginia, no matter what. They've come this far, and they're not going back. Chapter 4: Navigating Through the Chaos. As the vehicle proceeded with its journey toward Virginia, the scene outside the window changed dramatically. The once clamoring urban communities were presently frightfully calm, with overturned cars and debris littering the roads. George knew that navigating through the chaos would require all his wits and military training. The street was dangerous, with fallen electrical cables and abandoned vehicles making it challenging to drive. As they moved toward a curve in the street, they heard a lady shouting out for help. George and his grandparents approached the sound cautiously, finding a woman who was being attacked by a group of zombie-like creatures. George immediately surveyed the circumstance, taking out his handgun and shooting a few shots at the zombie-like creatures. The lady, who was injured and badly shaken, explained that she was traveling with her family when they were ambushed. She was the only survivor. George's grandparents quickly took the woman into their care, while George kept on keeping watch, looking for some other indications of risk. Fixing up her wounds. They encountered a few different survivors along the way, some of whom were frantically arguing for help and others of whom had transformed into careless animals, going after anything in their way. George and his grandparents were faced with split-second decisions, attempting to determine whom they could trust and who posed a threat. They must be cautious, constantly on the lookout for danger, and always prepared to protect themselves. As they passed through the barren roads, the truth of their circumstances hit them. The world, as they once knew it, was no more. The consequences of global warming had been horrifying, leaving behind a wasteland filled with death and destruction. However, George and his family are still dedicated to traveling to Virginia to join their friends and family. They pushed on, exploring through the confusion and keeping each other protected and safe. Finally, they arrived at Virginia's finish line, where another checkpoint spot awaited them. George informed them that his uncle lived in Tennessee, and they were permitted to pass. The journey continues to be a struggle, but they were still alive, still together, and still determined to make it to their destination. Chapter 5: The Military Checkpoint. After a night of exploring the turbulent and forsaken scene, George and his family have long been reunited with the rest of his family. They had no time to waste, they all immediately got into their vehicles with George in the lead, the next and last place Tennessee. On their journey to Tennessee, they continued to hit more military checkpoints. As they moved toward the designated spot, their pulses enlivened as they considered what sort of peril could lie ahead. The military had set up boundaries and was looking at vehicles individually before allowing them to pass. More in-depth searches than ever before. The troopers were watchful, and their firearms were prepared for George and his family. However, after hearing their story and checking their ID, they at long last permitted them to pass. George was feeling better, realizing that they were one bit nearer to their objective. He additionally realized that their process was so much closer to being finished. As they drove past the checkpoint, the surrounding scene changed dramatically. George realizes that they must be cautious, as the road ahead is loaded with risk, including zombie-like creatures and different survivors who could be dangerous. With crushing sadness, George kept driving, his thoughts floating to the relatives they had abandoned. He realized that they were putting their lives in extreme danger with each step they took. However, he likewise knew that the best way to guard them was to continue to push ahead. As they arrived at the boundary of Tennessee, George felt a promising sign. They were at long last near their objective, and with every mile they covered, they were that much closer to tracking down well-being and security. However, as they passed through the Tennessee open country, they experienced more hindrances and difficulties, constraining them to battle for their lives constantly. Yet, not everything is set in stone, and he realizes that his fast reasoning would assist him in defeating any difficulties that lay ahead. He was a man on a mission, and nothing would hinder him from getting his family somewhere safe. Chapter 6: Arrival in Tennessee. The sun was setting not too far off as the family showed up in Tennessee, the uncle's home at last in sight. The journey had been long and exhausting, with every mile feeling like 100. Wherever they looked, they were encircled by death and annihilation. Once thriving urban communities had devolved into ghost towns, with void roads and crumbling structures, a stark reminder of what the world had become. The journey had negatively affected everybody, leaving them all in a state of shock. The scenes of heinousness and bloodshed they had witnessed en route remained with them, haunting their memories and filling them with dread and unease. Perhaps they had been through some serious hardship themselves, and they were all relieved to finally have a place to rest. As they showed up at the uncle's home, the entryway opened, and a tall, wide-legged man showed up. He was George's uncle, and he looked similarly fatigued as they did. He embraced every one of them, tears streaming down his face, as he said thanks to God that they had made it. The family went into the house, depleted yet thankful. They embraced and cried. It was easy to be brought together and safe. As they got comfortable, they all paused for a minute to ponder the close-to-home effect of their journey. They had lost such a great deal en route, and the recollections of the savagery and demise that they had seen would remain with them for eternity. Yet, despite the despair, they were loaded up with a feeling of assurance. George, the head of the family, was an inquisitive and quick-reasoning man with a foundation in the military. He had a savage assurance to keep those he cherished safe and would remain determined to safeguard them. As they sat together, encompassed by the affection and solace of family, they realized that they had endured the most horrendously terrible of it. They had confronted the horrors of the world and come out on the other side more grounded and stronger. What's more, as they floated off to rest, they were loaded up with trust for the future and a profound appreciation for the powers of profound devotion that had been presented to them thus far. The story closes with a reflection on the journey, on the adoration and boldness that had seen them through the haziest of times, and on the expectation that they held for what was to come. In a world desolated by obliteration and passing, they had found comfort in one another, and that's what they knew. Regardless of what the future held, they would constantly stand together. Epilogue: A new reality. As George and his family sunk into their uncle's home in Tennessee, they wanted to contemplate the revulsion they had confronted and the misfortunes they had endured en route. The world as they once knew it was gone, supplanted by another reality where peril hid everywhere, and life was a steady battle for endurance. Despite the difficulties, George and his family are still undecided about starting a new life in this new world. They began by invigorating the uncle's home and setting up a solid perimeter around it. They developed crops and raised creatures for food, and George utilized his tactical preparation to set up an arrangement of watches to protect them from any dangers. As the months passed, George turned into a pioneer among different survivors, utilizing his fast reasoning and critical thinking abilities to assist them with defeating the difficulties they confronted. He coordinated gatherings to rummage for provisions, set up exchanges with different networks, and gave assurance and security to those out of luck. In this new truth, George's experience in math ended up being significant, as he utilized his abilities to monitor the provisions they had and to make arrangements for what was to come. He showed others how to do likewise, guaranteeing that their local area was good to go for any difficulties that might come their way. Notwithstanding the steady risk and the uncertain future, George and his family discovered a feeling of trust and reason in this new world. It is still up in the air whether I will have an impact, help others, and create a better future for them and for a long time in the future. As George looked around his neighborhood, he realized that they had not only survived the apocalypse, but also learned how to thrive in it. The journey they had taken, loaded up with misfortune and disaster, had carried them to this spot, where they had discovered another feeling of direction and another family to call their own. Furthermore, as the sun set on their new reality, George realized they were ready for anything that was to come.